Video, I'd like to provide students with an introduction as they begin the study of Chapter 7 of Book 2 in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In Chapter 6, we talked about actions, and we said that bad actions are manifold in the sense that any action that doesn't hit the mark of the medium between opposing vices is a bad action. And the only action that can be called good is the one that hits the mark. And therefore, there's only one way to perform a good action. There's only one way to perform a good action, but there are an infinite number of ways to perform a bad action. And that was sort of a general principle that Aristotle taught in Chapter 6. Now in Chapter 7, Aristotle is going to move from this general principle to apply it to particular virtues and vices, particular actions. All right? Chapter 7 is a bit lengthy, so I'm going to read through it and just make a few comments where I feel that it would be helpful for students making their first reading. But I'll try to keep those comments limited so we can get through this chapter and not have this video drag on too long. So let's read together Chapter 7 of Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It is necessary not only to assert this universally about actions, good and bad actions, but also to adapt it to particular. For in what is said concerning actions, universal assertions indeed are more common, but those that are particular are more true, since actions are conversant with particulars, with which assertions ought to accord. So since our actions have to deal with specific virtues and vices, our teaching about morals has to deal with those particular things and not just be some general talk about good and bad actions. Remember, the goal is not merely to know what virtue is in ethics, but to actually become good men. And that requires us to deal with particulars. These, therefore, are to be assumed from description. The word description is important, and I should comment on it because it's distinguished from definition. In philosophy, the definition of a thing is when we identify the real essence of something by naming the genus to which it belongs and the difference which separates it from other members of its genus. Okay? So a definition is a very specific statement about a thing. Whereas we may often speak about a thing without giving its true definition, and when we do so, that's called a description. So if I were to ask you, what is a tree? It's actually quite difficult for us to define a thing truly, because we have to know its true genus and the difference or the attribute that causes it to differ from other members of its class. It's actually difficult to give definitions of things. But what we'll often do is we'll name a number of characteristics of a thing, and when we do that, we're merely giving a description of a thing. So we should keep in mind when we see the word description in Aristotle's writing in this English translation, it's usually to distinguish from a definition. Okay? Of fear and confidence, therefore, if we take fear and confidence as two extremes, fortitude is the medium between the two. Of the characters, however, which exceed, the one indeed which exceeds by a privation of fear or a lack of fear is anonymous. In other words, there's no name for it. But that which exceeds in confidence is called audacious. He who exceeds in being afraid, but is deficient in confidence, is timid. So we have timidity on one extreme, audacity on the other extreme, and courageous or fortitude as the medium between the two. In pleasures and pains, however, though not in all pleasures, but in such as are corporeal or bodily, and in those especially which pertain to the touch, and in a less degree in pains, the medium indeed is temperance. Excessive pleasure is on one extreme, insufficient desire for pleasure is on the other extreme. The balance between the two is temperance. The excess would be intemperance, excessive desire for pleasure. But those who are deficient in the pursuit of pleasures do not very frequently occur, on which account neither have they obtained a name. So because this particular condition, men who don't pursue pleasure enough don't really exist, that vice really doesn't have a name. They may, however, be called insensate or unfeeling. In giving and receiving money, the medium is liberality, but the excess and defect are prodigality. The excess of giving money or wasting money is prodigality, and illiberality is the defective giving of money, not giving enough, to be illiberal. So illiberal is not giving enough, prodigality is giving too much, and liberality is the medium, in which men exceed and are deficient in a contrary way. For the prodigal indeed exceeds in spending money, but is deficient in receiving it. And the illiberal man exceeds in receiving money, but is deficient in spending money. At present, therefore, we think it sufficient summarily to adumbrate or sketch these things, but afterwards we will discuss them more accurately. With respect to wealth, however, there are also other dispositions of the mind, and the medium indeed is magnificence. For the magnificent differs from the liberal man in this, that the former, excuse me, I got two bees flying around by me. The magnificent differs from the liberal man in this, that the former is conversant with great things. The magnificent man has to do with great things, great works, whereas the liberal man has to do with small things. The excess, however, is an ignorance of elegance and decorum, and illiberal profusion. But the defect is an indecorous parsimony in spending money. And these vices differ from those which surround liberality. So there's more to being generous. It's as if there's two different kinds of generosity. There's liberality, which is just sort of an everyday generosity, a simple generosity, helping your neighbors, being helpful to those around you, sharing money virtuously according to reason. And then there's magnificence, which has to do with very wealthy people who have the ability to do very great works. For example, in the ancient world, a very wealthy man might be expected to fund an army, provide armor and horses and equip an army, or pay for the construction of a ship for the navy and so on. Those works are considered magnificent works, or building a temple, paying for the construction of a temple or a church. Those are works of magnificence. And they really are the business of wealthy men, very wealthy men. So it's a different level, a different kind of generosity. Whereas a liberal man, he doesn't have the resources to do those great works, which is what magnificence means. And so the liberality of a common man is one thing. The magnificence of a wealthy man is something else. Okay? These vices differ from those which surround liberality, but in what they differ we shall afterwards show. With respect to honor and ignominy, or dishonor, the medium is magnanimity. Magnanimity. Magna would mean great, and anima would mean soul. So magnanimity means possessing a great soul. The excess is called a certain inflation of the mind, and the defect is called pusillanimity. Pusillanimity. As we have said, however, that liberality corresponds to magnificence, but differs from it in this, that it is conversant with small things, so to magnanimity, which is conversant with great honors, another certain virtue corresponds, and which also is itself conversant with that which is small. For it is possible to aspire after honor in such a manner as is proper, and more and less than is proper. But he who exceeds in his desires of honor is said to be ambitious, having too much concern for honor. And he who is deficient, who doesn't seek honor as he should, is unambitious. And the middle character between both is anonymous. The dispositions also are anonymous, except the disposition of the ambitious man, which is denominated ambition. Hence the extremes contend for the middle place. And we indeed sometimes call the middle character ambitious, and sometimes unambitious. And sometimes we praise the ambitious, and sometimes we praise the unambitious man. But from what cause we do this will be shown hereafter. Now, however, conformably to the manner in which we begun, let us speak about the rest. With respect to anger, therefore, there is likewise excess, defect, and a medium. But these are nearly anonymous. We call the middle character a mild man, and the medium we call mildness. But of the extremes, let him who exceeds be called wrathful, and the vice be called wrathfulness. And let him who is deficient be a man void of anger, and the defect a privation of anger. There are likewise 3 other media, or mediums, which have indeed a certain similitude or likeness to each other, but differ from each other. For all of them are conversant with the communion of words and actions, but they differ because one of them is conversant with the truth which is in them, but the others are conversant with the delectable or desirable. And of this, that is, the delectable, one kind consists in jest or joking, but another in all the concerns of life. We must therefore also speak concerning these, in order that we may in a greater degree perceive that in everything the medium is laudable or praiseworthy, but the extremes are neither right nor laudable, but reprehensible or worthy of blame. Of these, therefore, the greater part also are anonymous. But we must endeavor in the same manner as in the rest to give names for them, for the sake of perspicuity, that means clarity, and the facility of understanding what follows. With respect to truth, therefore, the middle character may be called veracious or truthful, and the medium truth. but of dissimulation. That kind which exaggerates may be called arrogance, and he who possesses it an arrogant man. And that which extenuates may be called irony, but he who employs it may be denominated ironical or a dissembler. With respect, however, to the delectable, and that kind which consists in jest or joking, the middle character may be called facetious, and the disposition itself called facetiousness. But the excess in jesting may be denominated or named scurrility, and he who possesses it be called a scurrilous man. And he who is deficient may be called a rustic man, and the habit itself rusticity. In the other species of the delectable, which pertains to the concerns of life, he who delights in such a way as is proper is a friend, and the medium is friendship. But he who exceeds, if it is not with a view to any advantage, is studious of pleasing, but if for the sake of advantage, is a flatterer. And he who is deficient, and in all things unpleasant, is contentious and difficult to be pleased. These are likewise media in the passions, and in things pertaining to the passions. For bashfulness is not a virtue, and yet the modest man is praised. For in these things one indeed is called the middle character, another is said to exceed, and another to be deficient. And he indeed who exceeds and is bashful in all things is, as it were, astounded. But he who is deficient and is not ashamed of anything is impudent. And the middle character is the modest man. Indignation is a medium between envy and joy for the calamity of others. But these habits are conversant with the pain and pleasure arising from what happens to others. For he who is propense to indignation is indeed pained from those that do well undeservedly. But he who is envious, surpassing the indignant man, is pained from all who do well. And he who rejoices in the calamities of others is so much deficient in feeling pain from the prosperity of bad men that he is delighted with it. These things, however, are discussed by us elsewhere, that is, in the second book of Rhetoric. With respect to justice, however, since it is not predicated simply, in other words, since justice can be used in a number of different senses, we shall make it the subject of discussion hereafter, namely in the fifth book, and show how each of its parts is a medium. In a similar manner also we shall speak concerning the rational or intellectual virtues in the sixth book. So, that's all for chapter 7. There's a lot of content in there. I didn't spend a lot of time clarifying every point that he discusses because, as he himself says throughout the chapter, he's merely introducing us to the sort of a table of contents of what's going to follow in this book. And so what we see that's important here is that we're going to take this general principle that good action is the medium between two extremes, one of defect, not enough, and one of excess, too much. We're going to identify the virtues between each pair of extremes, of vices. And we're going to go one by one through all of these different vices and virtues. And we're going to do that for the rest of this book. And so while there's a lot of content, a lot of vocabulary and new terms introduced in chapter 7, I encourage you to read through it and become familiar with it, but don't feel any pressure to understand and master everything that he names in this chapter, because he's merely laying out what we're about to begin studying in coming chapters. Okay, so it's a good guide to the content of our coming studies as we move from a universal statement or a general statement about good actions and bad actions to now more specific investigations of good and bad actions as we work through the virtues and vices in the future chapters. All right, so I hope that's a helpful introduction to Chapter 7 of Book 2 in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's time for you now to study on your own for mastery, complete the lesson assessment, and we'll keep moving on in this important study of classical ethics. God bless your studies.